Okay, hello. It's 5 past. We've got people in the room. I think I'm going to get started. And Paul, I'm going to let you be in charge of that waiting room. We've got people still coming through. I'm going to take the ending of song number 1 as a sign to begin. So thank you all for being here, and see if my technology works. So hello, welcome everybody to this presentation as part of Digital Leaders Week on digital accessibility for non-profit organisations. We've got around 60, 70 people in the room, which is fantastic. Give it a few more minutes. I can see some people just kind of trickling in or so. So firstly, just hello. My name is Molly Gavriel. I'm the Partnerships Manager at DEV, the Developer Society. And I'm here today with my colleague Paul, who you can see. Paul, so wait. And Paul's DEV's Creative Director. Paul will be here sort of helping out on the chat. Also, at the end, we're going to have some questions and answers. So any design-related queries around accessibility and web design, Paul's there to support later on. And we've also got Miles in the room from Digital Leaders, and Miles will be helping and is able to share live transcription if you require it. So I don't know, Miles, if you just want to repost in the chat that link for everybody, because I know sometimes you can't see the chat that happened before you came into the room. Okay, so Paul and I are from the Developer Society. Our website is dev.ngo. And the Developer Society, we're a web agency, and we're also the world's first non-profit team of developers and designers run by and for the non-profit sector. And what that means is that we work exclusively with non-profit and mission-driven organizations. So just to start off, a little bit of housekeeping. Firstly, everything today is being recorded. I say that with confidence, and I can see the little red button, so it is. That's great. If you miss anything, if you've just come into the room, that's fine. We'll share the recording with you afterwards. I can share my slides. I'm really happy to share my slides, and I'll try and email that out to everyone through Digital Leaders afterwards. And finally, if you need captions, type CC in the chat now. And you can also get the transcript link from Miles that I just mentioned. And this is how you do the chat. In case you haven't been in Zoom before, there should be a little chat box thing in the toolbar at the bottom there. So it's going to be a 15-minute presentation, followed by around 20 minutes Q&A. So just under 40 minutes in total. And there's some useful resources in my slides. At the end afterwards, I'll share my slides with everyone, and there's some links there, loads of tools, practical information to get stuck in and learn more about digital accessibility. So firstly, what is digital accessibility? So you might be here because you've been told that you need to learn about this. And it's now a requirement for some organisations in the UK to make sure that their sites meet accessibility standards. And there's something called the WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which look like this, which some of you might have seen. This might be news to others. And there are also guidelines, if you go on gov.uk, which look like this. And actually, these are pretty comprehensive guidelines and potentially a bit daunting, to be honest. And you also might have spotted that these are guidelines. And I just want to quote, I need to sort of hide my own face here, but I'm just going to quote for you from the gov.uk guidelines that the accessibility regulations build on your existing obligations to people who have a disability under the Equality Act 2010 or the Disability Discrimination Act 1995 in Northern Ireland. And these say that all UK service providers must consider reasonable adjustments for disabled people. And I was going to admit someone from the waiting room. And you might be wondering, what is reasonable? It seems quite a general thing. And you might also be wondering why do we have these requirements around digital accessibility? So I just want us to take a step back, and rather than thinking about accessibility here, and rather than focusing on guidelines and guidance and legislation, because to be honest, if I was going to give a presentation on that, I think I'd probably need at least a couple of months rather than a couple of minutes. I want us to focus today on access. So for example, a ramp allows wheelchair users to access a building. And it also allows somebody with a buggy to access a building. And I think the point here is that, sorry, it's gone too far. But the point here is that ramps allow people to access buildings. So another example is that the average reading age of a deaf adult is 9. So if you're thinking about designing content that's accessible to deaf adults, you might want to think about pitching your web content to have a reading age of around 9, so it's accessible to most people. So simplifying written content will make it more accessible for deaf people, but it also benefits people who have English as a second language if you're writing in English, or people who have a lower reading age on average. It makes life a lot easier for dyslexics, and yeah, Paul's agreeing there, or anybody who needs to find information quickly and easily. And I think this is really the point I want to think about, is when I think about designing for accessibility, it's about the halo effect of how good design makes life better and makes services easier for everyone. So 15% of the global population experience some form of recognized disability. Almost all of us will know or work with someone or live with somebody who has a disability. On top of that, you have people who have temporary impairments. So this might be, for example, when you break a leg and you have a temporary impairment, or situational impairments. So you can't text while you drive, for example, or you shouldn't text while you drive. So designing for accessibility is fundamental for usability in general. And more than that, designing for accessibility drives innovation. I just want to highlight some things, for example, voice recognition. One I just mentioned about driving and texting. Voice recognition is beneficial, but voice recognition was developed as an accessibility tool. Live captioning. So some of you might be using the captions transcript that Miles has posted in the chat to access this talk. And also translation services, online translation. If you travel so many countries around the world now and you're trying to communicate with someone who doesn't speak your language, they might pick up their phone, talk into it, and have an automatic translation. So I'm going to move us on to some other things to think about. And these are accessibility points more broadly, one of which might be access to the internet. So what level of bandwidth do people have? How are people accessing the internet? I'm sitting here talking to you through a laptop, but for many people, their access to the internet is mobile first, or they might not even have their own internet connected devices. And also confidence using digital tools. And this is something that we've seen become increasingly significant in 2020, I'll leave it at that, as more people move to working online and working from home. And one of the things I often get asked about when I'm contacting charities or speaking to people who work at charities is, are there golden rules for web design for accessibility? And well, the answer is yes and also no. But I'm going to start with yes, because I feel like this will be more beneficial for everyone here today. And one of these is around contrast. So making sure that you have good color contrast, making sure that you're not creating things that are difficult to read or layering over images, and designing clear content. And we touched on this when I mentioned readability. So making sure your content is clear, easy to understand, well laid out. Designing to be simple and intuitive will always help with accessibility. Reducing barriers to accessing your content. And also providing information in different formats. And this might actually be slightly contradictory, but if you think about somebody who has a visual impairment might require audio content in order to be able to understand and access your materials, and someone with a hearing impairment might require that content to be transcribed or written in order to access the same materials. So just being aware of the different users, how they access your content, and how you can accommodate as many different formats as possible. And then really simplifying it. If that's not, within your means, just stripping it back and simplifying it. Going back to those other golden rules I talked about. So examples of different formats might be videos with captions, written information, images with alt text. And that's really important wherever you have images online, making sure that these are described, making sure that you're able to demonstrate why you have that image and what it's there for. So digital accessibility is about creating online systems and services that work for the largest number of people possible. Unfortunately, you're probably never going to be able to design something that works for everyone everywhere, but you can design for the largest number of people possible. And it's really about understanding who is using your website or who is using your digital product. And it's about understanding what their needs are. And I think this is really, for me, this is what's so interesting and exciting about digital accessibility, is really understanding your users. It's about understanding how good design can help to meet their needs. And in my opinion, but I think also in our experience, I'm sure Paul will support me on this, nonprofits are often best placed to understand user needs. It's one of the reasons I love working with nonprofit organizations. Nonprofit organizations will often have a clear mission and purpose. They'll be mission driven. They'll have a strong understanding of who their users are. They know why they're delivering those services. Often we find that nonprofits are user-led, and they're often delivering community-facing services. Not all, but most of the nonprofits we work with are ticking at least one of those boxes. And I think that really helps. Like when you're going back to learning about digital accessibility, these things will really help you to develop accessible services. So we're going to move on to some questions now. And firstly, I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone who submitted questions in advance. So I know that not everyone had a chance to do so, but some of the early birds would have got an email from me asking please to fill out a survey, and we had a really huge response. And we're not going to have time to answer everyone's questions here today, but I want to just start with some of the people who submitted their questions in advance, and then for everyone else, we'll have a bit of time to ask some more questions. So one of the first questions we received, and I just need to double check this, I think, I can't remember, Paul, sorry, was around, so the question was, we know we need to make our website more accessible, but we don't know where to begin in terms of finding out what that might look like in practice. And I believe that was a two-parter to this one, because we had, this question was so, this is addressing a lot of people's questions here. And the second one was, how do we cater for a range of access needs in a way that doesn't take too much time, and keen to make our website more accessible, but it isn't an institutional priority. And this, I guess this one's really relevant for people working in the nonprofit sector. Often there are limited resources. You might have to focus your resources on delivering frontline services, for example, and digital accessibility can seem like a lower priority. So firstly, I just want to say I really hope this presentation's made a good business case as to why accessibility should be a priority. I think fundamentally it is about designing good services, and it's about usability. And there's another sort of quick answer here, which is that you can use an accessibility checker tool to assess your existing website and work out where you are. And in the resources that I've got at the end of this presentation that I'll share with everyone afterwards, I've listed 1 or 2 accessibility checkers that you can use. And I think this is my final point on this one, but accessibility is often about simplicity. So it shouldn't be a barrier. It should just be about actually prioritizing your content and working out what your priorities need to be. Paul, do you want to add to this one?
Yes, so that point about starting by working out where you actually are at the moment is really important, because I kind of equate it to wanting to scale Everest, in that you can't get to the top unless you know where you are right now. Because for some people, you might be on the other side of the world. For some people, you might be at least on the right continent. For some people, you're in the foothills. Some people, you are at base camp already. And for each of you, where you are right now will modify the changes that you might need to make. And so for some people, you might be terrified that you've got this huge mountain to climb, but actually what you haven't spotted is that you're already halfway up. So that for me is the most important thing to start with, is to track down one of these accessibility checkers, and there's numerous out there. And as Molly says, we've got some links to some of those for you to reference. But you'll be surprised actually that a lot of you will already be quite a long way along. Anybody who's using relatively contemporary content management systems, things like WordPress is relatively good, for example, you will probably find you're not far away from being in a relatively good place. But if you want to scale that mountain, it starts by working out where you are today. And that's the first step for you.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I've had numerous conversations with people where we've started to discuss accessibility and then realize they're much further along that journey than they think. And really, just going back to the same point, don't overcomplicate things if in doubt, and don't use fancy integrations or flashing images or complicated language. Just think about what is your core message, what you're trying to do, what do your users need to know how to do. I've also remembered as well, when you were talking for, I have glasses are a really, I think, overlooked like impairment. I was thinking like, oh, my glasses steaming up, now I can't read my screen. Anyway, so another point here is make sure you have decent color contrast, make sure your site works on mobile and can load at low internet speeds. So even without doing much user testing, without doing a huge overhaul project, you can start with some of these simple steps. However, always test your site with your users and always get their feedback. I think that's really, really key. I just want to show some examples as well. I've just mentioned that Dev are a web agency, so why not show off some of our wonderful work? Paul, I believe this is one of your projects. So this was a project that we worked on for Fight Inequality. It was really simple project. It was on a very low budget and very tight turnaround. But really, it was by stripping it back, it was able to tick a lot of accessibility boxes as well. I don't know if you want to say some words to that, Paul.
Yeah, often designers do a really bad job of thinking about this, because often the thing that looks pretty isn't always the same thing as the thing that's accessible. So, like, hands up, historically we are the creators of lots of issues here. But I think the thing to bring home is that for a designer, constraint is inspiring. That actually the limitations of a thing often drive you to find more interesting ways to solve the problem that's in front of you. And so this is a really good example. The brand as it was meant that we were able to explore very, very high contrast. Thematically, it was about a very high contrast issue. And so it meant that we're able to lean directly into that. And when Molly talks about high contrast, the kind of areas of light and dark and so on, the way that we're using color to create difference, as well as then through the content, is kind of what we mean. It's about how great the difference is between the highs and the lows, and anything that you want to be clear and visible for people. Just make sure that if you squint your eyes, if you can still read what's there, then that will address loads of the visual side of things. But that as a theme is a common recurrence, and the industry is changing and moving along, and we can always do a better job of serving you. So that's our aim.
That's great, thanks, Paul. I don't have to squint, I just have to take my glasses off. So the second question we had come through, and this one again, it's another one that we had a lot, was how can you make sure that your site is accessible when you're working in a small team and everyone has to add content? And I love this question because it's such a sort of tricky issue to deal with, and it's so, again, it's really specific, I think, to the third sector. So some of the points that we put together around this were about having a style guide that includes things like readability and adding alt tags to images. Just make sure some of those basic points I mentioned earlier are covered off in your style guide. And do invest time in training people to edit content with a focus on accessibility. And I think really, unfortunately, that is unavoidable, but you do need to take time to just make sure that people are aware of the basics of accessibility. And to make sure that your website is coded in an accessible way, maintain it through good content management. So Paul, I'm going to hand back to you here because I think you might have some other things to add, and I think you might be able to talk to this case study that I've also pulled up from the Dev archive portfolio.
Yeah, thank you. So I think in terms of what's in front of us here, this is a really good example of design working really hard to ensure accessibility. This was some work that we did for Macmillan a little while back. It's still being used to this day, but it's a way that they could put their branded font in the hands of people without them needing to be fully trained typographers. Their guidelines have a whole raft of color guidelines. You can and can't use this color on top of that one, and so on. And so it was really important that we built a tool that enabled people to build these lines of type, but not having to worry about what accessibility was. So it explicitly prevented you from putting color combinations together that weren't going to be accessible. Which is a really important component within what we built. So you could choose like the text color and then the background color, and we engineered it such that the accessibility of that type was core. So, and that applied to the smaller type as well within that. So that was a really key building block. Just to add a little bit to what Molly was talking about earlier about style guides. One of the things that often gets used, you can normally, if you've got a content management system or something, you use your headers to define like type styles, and you think, oh, actually, you know what, this body bit of text here, I just want to be bigger. So you end up using the H1 or the H2 or and so on in order to be a shortcut to styling something. But actually, that's hugely counterintuitive because people who are using screen readers and so on, typically they will use settings within that will just skip content and just read like the headlines. And if you've set massive paragraphs of your page content as a header style, then actually the screen reader is going to read all of that text before it jumps to the headline. And if it's actually not a headline in the meaningful semantic sense of it, then actually that's really going to get in their way. So style guides can be really, really helpful because they set in place a whole range of ways of articulating your content and styling your content in a way that's actually completely invisible for people who take this kind of stuff for granted. So that's a really helpful point, is that yes, it's actually just about the way that you mark up your text. And that's often just as a user when you're copying and pasting content in, just about which options you select. And you can sidestep a load of these issues simply by putting some of these guidelines in place, saying, don't do this, do that. Things like your alt tags. If you're unfamiliar what an alt tag is, it's a bit of content that sits behind the picture in the HTML, behind figuratively speaking. And it's a literal description of the contents of the image. So you might be tempted to say, picture of our holiday in Somerset. But actually, what the alt tag needs to be is a rolling landscape with two children playing on a beach on the side. One of them is holding a spade and they've got a sandcastle. It's about describing the literal content of the image. And that becomes even more important where you've got text embedded in the image as well. So it means that literally everybody has access to that image, that it's not invisible, particularly if that's really key messaging for you and what you're doing with your charity. Molly?
No, that's brilliant. Thanks, Paul. And yeah, it's a bit like the phone conversation, isn't it? How would you describe that image on the phone? This is where I feel like going back to that point around users and user testing, usability. Neither Paul nor myself use the screen reader, but by running workshops and testing things with people who do, we're able to gain these insights. And that's not something that we do because we work for a web agency or because Paul's a designer. It's something that anyone can do when they're looking at how to improve their digital projects for accessibility purposes. So the next question, this was quite a fun one, came in, was should there be set features, e.g. like SEO, etc., that are implemented as a baseline on all websites? And I like this one because actually SEO isn't a feature. And like SEO, accessibility is an ongoing process. So you need to make sure that the content you add is working and iterate and refine your website based on user feedback. So SEO, just for anyone in the room who doesn't deal with this day in, day out, is like search engine optimization. So it's how you can develop your content and your website to make it go up the search results when you look for something in Google. So if I was looking for, a new pair of sunglasses, I might search sunglasses shop London, or I don't know. And so it's how those businesses then get up the search term. And I think that's something that you always have to be looking at and reviewing, and accessibility is the same. Paul, do you want to talk to that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's that point is key. It's an ongoing process. It's not something that you can just install on day one and then forget about, because it's a process that you have to engage with every time you interact with a bit of content on your own website. So yes, it's a thing that your website will need to be coded for in a whole bunch of intentional ways. And there's loads of resources that we can link you to in this document, which will come out subsequently. And there's loads of questions that you can ask of your developer as to whether loads of that is being coded appropriately and to what degree that's being tested. But once you've got that, that's not then a kind of a nice, comfortable sofa that you get to lie back on. It's actually something that you have to engage with every day. Because when you run one of those accessibility checkers, loads of the issues that will come back will be about actually the way that content has then subsequently been put into the website, rather than the way that the website has been coded. And what you will find is that 90% of issues like this over time are actually because of the content and the way that it's been populated, not because of the way that the website has been coded. So you can start with a perfect, pristine thing, but if you don't maintain it, if you don't look after it, it's going to get pretty grubby pretty quickly. And so accessibility is a process rather than something that you install.
I've put in a thing about alt text on a slide that I won't read out to everyone, but just hammering home a point here. Yeah, there you go. There's no plugin for accessibility. And this one was an interesting one, which came through that I felt was very topical, which said, as so many business meetings move online, we're less sure about how best to hold meetings on accessible platforms. And I also saw a comment that was interesting in the chat. Someone had mentioned that young unemployed people, there was a high percentage of people they were working with who had a disability. And I think when you're looking at work, there are actually some real huge advantages to doing online meetings like this for people who have disabilities or have access requirements, because actually it's removed that barrier. You don't need to think about venues and transport and all those other things in the same way that you might have done previously. So I do think this is like a really nice one to talk to in the current climate. But again, it is about usability. So what tools and plugins are people already using? What they're using them for? What do you need them to do? And then once you understand this, you can start to design your approach. And I don't know if I've got this on the next slide. Oh yeah, so here's an example I quite liked from a workshop I was running recently. So we use something called Slack as an instant messaging platform, and you can use Slack to share files. A lot of businesses will use it. A lot of people in this room will be familiar with it. But because you can use it to share notes and transcripts and get feedback and provide tech support, it's not designed as an accessibility tool, but the way you can use it is as an accessibility tool alongside something like Zoom. And there are other instant messaging platforms and other things I know that Paul, you're going to have to remind me what the transcript service is that Miles is using. Or Miles can maybe say.
I believe it's Otter that is being used.
Brilliant, thank you. And yeah, if anyone, there's a transcript note in the chat as well about that. There's also something I would really recommend to your users, if you've got service users who have a disability who are finding it difficult to join online meetings as a result. AbilityNet have a fantastic resource called Computer My Way, which provides support to make your device easier to use. And I've shared a link to that in the resources in this document that you'll get sent at the end. So there's a lot out there, but I think it's really for people who are designing these services. Again, it goes back to that point around usability and understanding user needs. Paul, go on, talk about one.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. There's a really good example a number of years ago now, that there was an organisation who was going the extra mile and like video content and was adding loads of video content, and they'd had like lots of sort of transcription stuff done, and they thought they were doing an amazing job. And they used YouTube to then embed that within their website, which is actually really good practice. There's no reason you ought not to do that. But actually, loads of screen readers, the way that the player that overlays over the video, the YouTube bit that YouTube control, actually wasn't accessible. And I don't know whether they've made improvements recently, but certainly as recently as a couple of years back, when a video started playing, all of the controls disappeared from the overlay, and all of a sudden you couldn't pause the video anymore through a screen reader. And so what we were working with a national charity at the time, and we actually recommended that they move all of their content off YouTube and put it on something different. What's the other big one? I forget. I should have looked.
Shout names. Are you Vimeo?
Vimeo, thank you. It was Vimeo, because Vimeos didn't suffer from that problem. The buttons were all accessible and so on. So it's at least in part about finding out which tools do work better, where you have to adopt things. One of the links that we found is an article from an organisation that's done a deep dive onto loads of these tools. To work out which ones work with which assistive technologies, and which therefore you can use as a starting point and know that it's going to have your back for people who have additional needs from those kinds of technologies.
Thanks, that's really interesting. And someone mentioned as well about the video compression for Vimeo. I think it really is about, especially if you're working with off-the-shelf tools, it's about working out like the strengths and weaknesses of different ones and who the users are, and again doing that thing where you might have to work across multiple formats or have integrations between formats too. But yeah, that usability testing really is key, and also it talks back to your point about it's a process, it's not a plugin. Final question that I have, and this is almost like a question to myself really, it was about what does A11Y mean? And this is just because it might come up, especially in some of the resources I put. So it just means accessibility, but for geeky webby people. That's my summary, Paul.
She's absolutely right. The context here is that often developers, in order to like shorten things and truncate them, they'll take the first letter and the last letter from a long word, and then the number relates to how many letters there are then in between that have been redacted, essentially. So there's 11 letters between the A and the Y, therefore A11Y, which also nicely phonetically you can pronounce as ally if you're a child of the 80s and grew up with AOL speak. So that's a good example.
And you can just say that to show off to your friends. But on the whole, jargon is bad for accessibility, I would say. So we've got a little bit of time left. I'm just going to give us 10 minutes now for some questions from the room, if there are any. And then I'm going to give you a little sneak peek of my slides, because I could see some questions around tools for testing. Oh yeah, if you have a question, just put it in the chat and we'll get to you. But a sneak peek here is, so these are the resources I've got, and I'm going to actually stop sharing my screen. I'm going to basically let you all show your lovely faces if you so wish to do so. But I just wanted to show you about the resources here at the end, so that this will all be available to everyone, and I will share the link in the slide and let Paul host. So if you do have there we go, I've stopped screen sharing, brilliant. Yeah, do feel free to turn on your slide. Paul, I don't know if you can see the chat. If you can, do take questions and I will get that slide link and send it around for everyone.
Yep, so I obviously can't see everybody's faces all on one screen. So if you do have a question, then feel free to type it into the chat, might be the easiest way. Alternatively, you should be able, feel free to turn your video on and unmute yourself. And all I ask is that you wait until we've answered one question until you then, and then we'll try to manage that through. We use a queuing system. So if you've got a question and you're happy to be on camera, if you'd like to ask a question after the current person talking, then raise one finger, 2 fingers if you've got a question after them, and so on. And then we'll manage it that way. So do we have a first question? Anyone? No?
We had some questions about testing sites. Oh, do you have an actual question? Captions. There's one from Ali for you there, Paul.
Yeah, so could you do me a favour and read it for me, and I'll think about it?
Yes, so it says, in terms of captions, GDS, so I'm guessing that's Government Digital Service, says best practice is you shouldn't use burnt in ones, but a transcript SRT. Do you guys happen to know why this is? And they're trying to gather user data to figure out what users prefer. But anecdotally, it seems like users like burnt-in subtitles. So I think this is a bit of a case of what the users are saying is contradicting to what the best practice guidance is. And I think that's fascinating.
By burnt-in, correct me if I'm wrong, what we're referring to there is where the caption is kind of part of the graphic. So somebody has sat down in Photoshop or similar and has generated the image and then included the text in the graphic itself and then saved that down as one file. Essentially, that's basically a very old habit. It used to be quite common to do that many, many years ago. And people have fallen into doing that kind of thing. It's not the end of the world if you're doing your alt tags well. But the way the technology is going, it's always better to use the structure of the HTML and the CSS, which provides for the kind of the tagged means of presenting that kind of thing. It assumes that your web developer or whoever is maintaining your site has coded those bits in an appropriate way, because sometimes they're a bit of an afterthought. But that would be why it's a problem, because if it's text that's part of the image, you end up then that's not accessible to a screen reader if somebody is not then using their alt tags. But then there are also additional issues elsewhere that are more granular when it comes to more developmental stuff. But yeah, use caption tools where you have them. And if you don't have the ability to explicitly add a caption to an image, the best thing that you can do is actually just to use the body of your article on your page, just to say the image above is ... and that then should help, in addition to your alt text.
Great. Someone has said there was a joke about no plugin for accessibility, but I've had experience utilizing plugins for WordPress-based websites that add some additional functionality, such as font scaling options, etc. And do we have any experience, and would we recommend any? And I think, Paul, this might be one where it's slightly different doing something yourself in-house as a team and doing something that like we would do as an agency. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, it was a tongue-in-cheek line. It's totally fair to say. I think the way that we were framing that was more that there isn't just like one thing that you can install on every site. It's you are relying on third-party tools from things, pardon me, like WordPress or Drupal or whatever flavor your website is. It relies on there being existing things, and there are examples out there, and those are some fairly good ones, of the kind of features that plugins can often add to your site, because all they're doing is modifying what we refer to as the div. So it enables you to just kind of modify live the way that the CSS is defined. The CSS is the bit of the website that defines the styling and the size of the fonts and the color of the fonts and so on. And those can work. What I would say is that being reliant on third-party plugins can sometimes be a bit of a double-edged sword, in that often you can just install a tool and it will work out of the box, but then what you're doing is you're relying on your provider of the website supporting that plugin, the provider of that plugin maintaining their code, future security updates, and so on. And so you can use them, but I would always caution against making it an intrinsic part of your response to these things, because it relies on those people keeping their end of the bargain up. And because you don't have, we refer to it as the who are you going to shout at problem. If your website breaks and you don't know why, who are you going to shout at to fix it? And sometimes your website can, if you're relying on a third-party tool for delivering things like your accessibility requirements, and that plugin breaks for some reason, you don't have a direct relationship with that person to shout at them when it breaks. And so it's often better, it's often a little bit more expensive and a little bit more time involved. But we would say it's always better to try and find the solution with your developer, if you have one, that will enable you to have that be part of the foundation of your site, rather than it being a plugin that you can install. That's not that plugins are bad or that you shouldn't use them. Don't hear that. It's more that it's all grey. It's not an absolute fix. You just need to be aware going in that that's the case.
Yeah, I love that. I definitely heard you say that you can shout at your web developers for, so that's what I'm taking away from that. Sorry. There was someone asked a question here about user testing, about services or organizations you can recommend. I'm going to post out a little link in the chat to a website called Dovetail, which is, dev on it, so that you can find the Developer Society on there as web developers, but it's a directory of design and web development organizations that work with charities, including, there's a lot of organizations on there that do user testing. And I think, again, it goes back to your capacity as an organization and what you're trying to achieve. But I'd recommend also working with organization, and Paul does a lot of work on this, where you can actually build up your own in-house capacity and your own in-house knowledge and skills too. So if you were to work with Dev on a web project, or I'm sure any of the agencies on Dovetail, you'd probably go through a design discovery process, which would be very much focused on user testing and very much focused on training you and the people working on your team how to do that user testing process as well. I can see some people have made some lovely recommendations too. I really liked one from Rory about connecting people directly through Facebook groups and forums. Paul?
Yeah, so one organisation that we've worked with that we heartily recommend is I know them as DAC because that's their acronym, but it's the Digital Accessibility Centre. They are an amazing group of people based in South Wales, really weirdly about 2 miles from where I grew up, which was just surreal when we first started having a conversation with them. But we used them for a few things, and basically they have an entire building full of people who have accessibility needs, and they span the entire gamut from people who are partially sighted through people who have attention deficit and neurodiversity considerations. They have deaf people on staff. They have people who have neurological conditions, which means that they physically can't interact with computers in the way that we take for granted. And so basically, you just sit down with them, that you send them a link to the project that you're working on your website, and then you'll talk to them about all the things that are really important that you want feedback on as like a specific script that you want for user testing. And they basically put it in front of their entire team, and they go through all of the key building blocks. They look at the code, they look at the way your HTML is built, and then give you really explicit recommendations then for what you can do. They are very much viewed as the gold standard in the UK. They're used by people, I think gov.uk you've used them. They're used by the BBC, Channel 4 I know has used them. So they're really safe, incredibly powerful. We went and visited them for one of the projects that we worked on. And so we talked with the testers. We actually went round as they were testing on the project, and it was one of the most enlightening experiences I've ever had. It was when I realised just how poorly people who are hard of hearing are served by accessibility. Historically, I'm actually half deaf, but because I've got one functioning ear, I have taken for granted that I'm basically hearing functionally. But I genuinely had a lump in my throat when we were talking to the deaf tester, and just how exasperated she was by how little accessibility is thought about for people who are deaf, people who are hard of hearing. And it's because, as BSL speakers, British Sign Language speakers, English is not your first language. And it's the same as a French person coming to your website and having a functioning understanding of how English works. It's identical. That's why Molly was quoting that age statistic in terms of the reading age of a lot of BSL speakers earlier. It's for that reason. And so, yeah, I can recommend the DAC. If you like their services and your budgets allow for using them, I would heartily recommend going and shadowing the process. There's no extra fee for doing that. It is an incredible eye-opener, and it just changes the way that you think about the way people access websites. So I definitely give them a big plus. There are other services available.
Fantastic, thank you so much, Paul. It's copying your email address, Chris. That's great. Also a really good point around, community and diversity as well. The more people within your organisation who have accessibility requirements, the more you can learn and work together collaboratively, and likewise working with your users and being community focused in your work. It's a huge benefit, I think. So I think we're going to wrap up here. So that's everything from me and from Paul. But my email address is on that presentation link. There's also this is all being recorded. I will edit out the chat at the beginning, and then I'll send around the recording. I think Miles will be doing that from Digital Leaders side, but if not, then I will. That's absolutely no problem. I'm really glad that was useful. Thanks for the feedback. And yeah, do get in touch if we can ask if you've got any other questions. Brilliant. Thank you all for joining. Cheers. Bye.